You know this person, someone who has built something real, a career that matters, a business that sustains itself, a life that feels intentional. And if you have ever watched them closely, you have noticed something strange. They do not make things easier. They make things harder. Not accidentally. Not because they are punishing themselves. On purpose. They put friction into the parts of life that matter most. They make their important work harder to access. They build systems that require more effort, not less. They say no to the frictionless path even when it is available. Why? Here is what most people assume. They must enjoy suffering. They must have some deficiency, a lack of self-compassion, a need to prove something, but that is wrong. The real answer is the opposite of what you have been taught about success. Successful people understand something that most people miss entirely. Something about how human behavior actually works, not how we wish it worked. And here is the principle. Friction is not an obstacle to what matters. Friction is a filter. Think about what that means. Frictionless access to anything means anyone can do it. Casually, without commitment, without investment. A frictionless decision is made lightly. A frictionless attempt is abandoned lightly. Friction costs effort. Effort costs attention. Attention is the real currency of commitment. So when successful people deliberately add friction to certain things, they are not making those things worse. They are making those things more valuable. They are ensuring that only the committed attempt them. Only the serious pursue them. Only the people who have decided this matters actually do it. Everything that comes easily attracts the uncommitted. Everything that costs effort attracts only those who have genuinely decided. Friction is nature's way of filtering, and successful people have figured out how to use it. This matters because your brain is designed to take the path of least resistance. That is not a flaw, that is by design. Your ancestors survived by conserving energy. Your brain still operates on that ancient principle. Given two paths, one easy, one difficult, your brain will default to easy. Not because you are lazy, because that is how your neurology was wired. But here is what changes when you understand friction as a filter. Easy access to something does not make you more likely to do it. It makes you more likely to treat it casually. Every frictionless thing in your life competes equally for your attention. The important and the trivial sit side by side with zero distinction. Your brain cannot tell the difference, so it defaults to whatever requires the least effort in that moment. This is why people with perfect access to their goals often do not achieve them. The frictionless goal has no weight. It asks nothing of you, so it gets nothing from you. Meanwhile, the person who has placed friction between themselves and distraction is protected by that very barrier. They do not achieve more because they have more willpower. They achieve more because they have engineered their environment so that the right choice is the hard choice. And hard choices get done. Easy choices get abandoned. Everything you thought you knew about discipline is backwards. Discipline is not willpower. It is not the ability to do hard things through sheer force. Discipline is architecture. It is designing your life so friction protects what matters and blocks what does not. This creates a second principle that most people never see. Commitment signals work through friction, not through intention. When you say, "I am committed to this," your brain does not believe you until you prove it through effort. A commitment without cost is not a commitment. It is a hope. It is a wish. It is something you plan to do someday if it becomes convenient. But when you add friction, when you make something difficult to access, when you create a barrier that requires genuine effort to cross, now your brain believes you, because you have proven it through action, through sacrifice of ease, through deliberate difficulty. That is why someone who wakes at 4 in the morning for training means it. Why someone who pays for accountability means it. Why someone who eliminates all access to the distraction means it. The friction is the proof. Everyone says they are committed to what matters, but successful people show their commitment by building friction around it. Here is what most people never realize about this. The person who makes things hard is not more disciplined. They are just more honest about how human nature works. They stopped fighting their own neurology, stopped trying to willpower their way through a frictionless world. Instead, They engineered their world so that their neurology works with them, not against them. And that simple shift, from fighting yourself to designing around yourself, that is where everything changes. But here is what makes this really powerful. It is not just that friction filters out the uncommitted. There is a deeper mechanism at work, something that explains why friction actually improves the quality of every decision you make. Something that changes how you think about what you are trying to build. That mechanism is what we are going to explore next, because once you understand it, you will never look at an easy path the same way again. Here is the mechanism. When friction is removed from every option, your decision-making collapses. This sounds counterintuitive. You would think that more choices, easier access, frictionless pathways would make decisions better, faster, more confident. The opposite is true. Neuroscience has a name for this: decision paralysis. But that term is too gentle for what is actually happening to your brain. Every choice you can make without cost is a choice your brain cannot prioritize. Without friction, everything looks equally valid. The important goal and the convenient distraction wear the same weight. Your brain literally cannot tell the difference between them, so it defaults to relief, to ease, to whatever requires the least effort in that moment. This is why people with unlimited options often accomplish the least, not because they are lazy, because their brain has no way to distinguish the important from the trivial. Successful people understand this at a level most people never reach. They know that frictionless access to too many options is actually a cognitive trap. So they do something that looks insane from the outside. They deliberately reduce their options. They add barriers to anything that is not essential. They create friction not to torture themselves, but to simplify their decision-making. Here is the principal flip that most people miss. Constraints do not limit your choices, they clarify them. When you remove 90% of your options by making them difficult to access, your brain suddenly knows what matters. The remaining option, the one with effort attached, now has weight. It stands out. It commands attention. This is why the person who has decided in advance what they will eat, what they will wear, what time they will exercise, this person makes better strategic decisions all day long, not because they are more disciplined, because they have already spent their decision-making bandwidth on what actually matters. They have protected their cognitive resources by removing trivia from the decision set. There is a pattern here that most people miss because they are taught the opposite their entire lives. We are told that more options is always better, that freedom is the ability to choose from infinite possibilities, that constraint is the enemy. But your brain did not evolve for infinite options. It evolved to make decisions under scarcity, under limitation, under friction. In an environment of infinite frictionless choices, your decision-making apparatus fails. It is not designed for that. It is overwhelmed. It defaults to emotional relief rather than strategic thinking. But in an environment where options are limited and choices carry cost, your brain excels. Suddenly, every decision matters. Suddenly, you are not choosing between infinite possibilities. You are choosing between the few options worth the friction to access them. Your decision-making sharpens. Your clarity increases. Your focus deepens. This is not deprivation. This is optimization. This reveals a second layer of how friction actually works. Difficulty forces honest prioritization. When everything is easy, you can pretend to value things you do not actually value. You can say you are committed to your health while keeping frictionless access to every distraction. You can claim you want deep work while leaving your phone infinitely accessible. You can pretend your goals matter while keeping zero barriers between yourself and avoidance. But the moment you add friction, real friction, not performative difficulty, you have to choose. Do I actually value this enough to work for it? Or was I just enjoying the fantasy of it? Here is what cognitive science tells us. Your true priorities are not what you say you want. Your true priorities are what you make easy to do and hard to avoid. This is uncomfortable to realize because it means most people are not actually living their values. They are living the easiest version of their values. They are performing commitment to goals that they have made zero effort to protect from distraction. A person who says they want to write a novel but has frictionless access to infinite entertainment is not a person committed to writing. They are a person who enjoys the fantasy of being a writer, but a person who has made everything else hard to access? Who has created friction around every distraction? Who has designed their environment so that writing is the path of least resistance? That person will write. Not because they have more talent, not because they have more willpower, because they have been honest about their priorities and designed accordingly. Their friction is their honesty made visible. This connects to something that successful people have always known but rarely articulate. Skin in the game changes everything about decision quality. When a decision has cost, you think differently about it. When effort is required, you commit differently. When there is friction attached to a choice, you do not make it lightly. This is why the person who pays for coaching follows through on it differently than the person who watches free content. Why the person who has scheduled a specific time for their work protects that time differently than the person who plans to fit it in. Why the person who has burned their boats and made retreat impossible acts differently than the person with an exit strategy. It is not about punishment. It is about clarity. Friction creates skin in the game, and skin in the game makes every choice feel real. Most people live in a frictionless fantasy where they are free to abandon anything at any moment. So they do. So they abandon everything, but the successful person has eliminated their own escape routes. They have made certain things harder to undo. They have added friction to reversal, and in doing so, they have made commitment inevitable. What looks like weakness is actually strategic freedom. When you limit yourself through friction, you look like you are constraining your options, sacrificing possibility, narrowing your life. But the opposite is true. By making certain things hard to access, you have protected your capacity to achieve the things that matter. You have freed yourself from the tyranny of infinite choice. You have given yourself permission to ignore everything that is not essential. That is not constraint. That is liberation. But here is what makes this really interesting. The quality of your decisions does not actually come from having fewer options. It comes from clarity about which options deserve your energy. And that clarity only emerges when you have been willing to experience friction, to feel the cost of choice, to understand what you actually value by observing what you have made difficult. That is the revelation that changes everything about how you approach your goals. Because once you understand how friction reveals your true priorities, you can start designing it intentionally. Instead of having friction happen to you, through circumstances, through external barriers, through accidental limitation, you can build it deliberately. You can architect your life around it. And that is the architecture that actually works. There is something most people do not understand about how commitment actually works. We have been taught that commitment is a feeling, a decision you make internally, something that lives in your mind and heart. But successful people know that commitment is not internal. Commitment is external. It is built through action, through friction, through the deliberate difficulty of the path you have chosen. The moment you make something easy to access, you have made it easy to abandon. Here is the principle. Effort establishes ownership in ways that intention never can. Think about this carefully. When you say, "I am committed to this," your brain files that away as a preference, a want, a nice idea, something you think you should do. But when you actually invest effort, real effort, genuine difficulty, time and attention, something different happens in your psychology. You are no longer thinking about whether you want this. You are thinking about how to make it work, because you have already paid a cost to pursue it. This is the sunk cost principle, but it works in your favor when you understand it. Most people fear sunk cost. They think it is a trap. They think that effort you have already invested should not factor into your future decisions. And in pure logic, that is correct. Past effort should not influence future choices. But in human psychology, it absolutely does. And successful people do not fight that. They engineer around it. They deliberately create sunk cost in the things that matter most. They pay money up front. They make public commitments. They schedule time in advance. They create friction that has to be overcome to access their goals. And in doing so, they activate the part of their brain that says, I have already invested in this. I am not abandoning it now. That is not a trap. That is a tool. This is not about what you do. This is about who you have decided to be. There is a second layer here that most people never reach. When you add friction to accessing something important, you are not just creating a decision barrier, you are creating an identity marker. You are signaling to yourself who you have decided to be. The person who wakes at 5 in the morning to train before everyone else is awake is not just training. They are reinforcing the identity of someone who values health. The person who has eliminated all frictionless access to social media is not just avoiding distraction. They are reinforcing the identity of someone who protects their attention. The person who schedules deep work and makes that time untouchable is not just working. They are reinforcing the identity of someone who creates. Every time you choose the difficult path instead of the easy one, you are making a micro-identity decision. You are saying, this is who I am, this is what I do. And your brain believes you because you have proven it through friction, through cost, through choice made repeatedly under difficulty. This is why successful people say they do not have to motivate themselves. They are not motivated, they are identified. They have built friction into their lives in a way that their behavior now simply executes their identity. There is a pattern here that reveals itself once you start looking for it. In almost every domain where people struggle, health, creativity, learning, career advancement, the struggle is not the lack of access to what they want. It is the excess of frictionless alternatives, too much easy entertainment, too much frictionless distraction, too much access to escape. The person trying to write a book but never writing does not need more motivation. They need more friction around writing and less access to avoidance. The person who wants to get healthy but stays sedentary does not need to understand fitness better. They need to make fitness harder to access than comfort. The person who wants to learn but never studies does not need better learning materials. They need to build friction that makes avoidance impossible. Here is what cognitive science reveals. You do not choose what you want. You choose what you have designed your environment to make easiest. Your environment is not a backdrop. It is a force. It shapes your decisions more than your intentions do. So when successful people talk about motivation or discipline, what they are really talking about is environmental design. They have not overcome their neurology. They have allied with it. They have built friction into their world so that their biology pushes them toward what matters. Now here is where this becomes really powerful. When you add friction to commitment, something remarkable happens. The friction acts as a filter. It filters out the half-committed, the curious but not serious, the people who are performing interest rather than living it. And in filtering them out, it also filters out the part of you that is half-committed. When you have made something difficult to access, you are no longer wasting mental energy on casual consideration. You are not thinking, maybe I will do this someday if it becomes convenient. That thought no longer makes sense. You have already eliminated the convenient path. So your mind stops hedging, stops maintaining exit strategies, stops keeping one foot in and one foot out. You are all the way in because you have made halfway impossible. This is why successful people often describe a moment when everything changes. A moment when they went from wanting something to being committed to it. What actually happened in that moment? They changed the friction. They committed money. They told people. They set a deadline. They eliminated escape routes. They made one path harder and all others harder still. They did not become more motivated. They became more trapped in the best possible way. Their own choices had created the friction that made reversal costly. But here is what almost nobody realizes about how this works. The friction does not hold you through willpower. It holds you through something deeper, through the accumulated identity that comes from repeated choice under difficulty. Every time you choose the hard path, you are not just achieving that one goal. You are training your identity. You are building a version of yourself that chooses difficulty. That does not take the easy way out. That protects what matters through architecture, not through motivation. And that identity, built through friction, becomes self-reinforcing, becomes who you actually are, not who you are trying to be. This is the real power of deliberate difficulty. It does not create discipline through willpower. It creates discipline through identity. through a self-image so reinforced through repeated choice that abandonment stops being an option. The committed person does not perform commitment. They have become the kind of person for whom the committed choice is automatic, and they became that person by adding friction until the difficult path became their default. So the question becomes, which parts of your life are you willing to make harder? Because that question, answered through action, is the question that determines who you actually become. Now you understand why friction works, but knowing why something works is different from knowing how to build it. And this is where most people fail. They understand intellectually that friction helps. So they try to add it. They attempt to create difficulty. They download an app to block their phone. They make a public commitment. They set a deadline. And within days or weeks, it falls apart. Why? Because they have confused accidental friction with strategic friction. They have tried to impose willpower-based difficulty onto a system that requires architectural difficulty. There is a massive difference. Accidental friction is what happens when your environment blocks you against your will, when you have to work around a limitation, when difficulty is externally imposed and you are constantly fighting against it, trying to overcome it, resenting it. That friction does not hold, because every barrier you build against yourself becomes something you are trying to defeat. Every blocked app becomes a problem to solve. Every inconvenience becomes a challenge to overcome. Your brain is wired to solve problems, to find paths around barriers. So accidental friction just trains you in how to escape it. Strategic friction is the opposite. Strategic friction is built into systems. It is not something you fight against. It is the structure itself. Think about the difference. A person who tries to use willpower to avoid checking their phone every time they reach for it is fighting accidental friction. Their phone is right there. They are resisting it through effort. That effort runs out. But a person who has redesigned their entire environment, who has placed their phone in another room, who has switched to a device without notifications, who has built their workspace so that reaching for their phone requires crossing the room and unlocking a drawer, that person has not created accidental friction. They have created a system where the easy path is to not check the phone. The friction is not something they are fighting against. It is just how the world is structured now. Here is the hidden pattern most people never see. Your environment does not resist you. Your environment shapes you. This is the distinction that changes everything. When you build friction into your systems, into the physical layout of your space, into your schedules, into your routines, into the order in which things happen, that friction is not an obstacle you have to overcome. It is just the way things work now. You do not have to motivate yourself to follow a system you have built. You just follow the system, because the system enforces it. This is why people can maintain behaviors through systems that they cannot maintain through willpower. The system does not require willpower. It requires acceptance. You have to accept that this is how things work now, and once you accept it, your behavior follows automatically. This reveals something important about how environmental systems actually function. The friction in a system is not felt as burden, it is felt as structure. A person who works in an office where deep work is protected, where phones are silenced, where notifications are off, where there are no meetings before 10 a.m., that person does not feel friction, they feel support. The system supports them. But a person who works in an open office with constant interruptions, with no boundaries on their time, with every moment available for meetings, that person feels friction. The friction is in everything except their work. Same concept. Opposite direction. The friction can point toward what matters, or away from it. The question is which direction you have designed it. Successful people have learned to design friction architecturally. They do not add one barrier and hope it holds. They build systems where multiple barriers exist in tandem, where one friction reinforces another, where the entire structure is built to make the right choice the easy choice. Your brain does not care how many barriers exist between you and a goal. Your brain cares about which path costs the least effort right now. So if you want to create something that matters, you do not add one friction to protect it. You add multiple frictions to everything else. You make every distraction difficult. You make every alternative path costly. And in doing so, you have not created friction around your goal. You have created a system where your goal is the path of least resistance. That is architectural friction. This is where the concept of the friction spectrum becomes important. Friction is not binary. It is not present or absent. It exists on a spectrum. No friction means unlimited access, complete ease, no barriers, everything available simultaneously. Maximum friction means complete blockade, zero access, impossible to bypass without extraordinary effort. But the useful friction lives in the middle of that spectrum. There is a friction level for training, a level where the barrier is real but surmountable, where you have to choose deliberately, but it is still possible to access what you want. This friction level filters out casual attempts while allowing genuine commitment. There is a friction level for elimination, a level where something is possible but so difficult that you simply do not access it anymore. Not because it is forbidden, because the cost is too high. There is a friction level for flow, a level where something you want to do repeatedly is given just enough friction to feel intentional, but not so much that it becomes burdensome. Successful people do not build maximum friction around everything. They calibrate. They understand that different goals require different friction levels, and they design accordingly. Here is what this looks like in practice. Someone protecting deep work might add medium friction, a dedicated space, a specific time block, a phone in another room, notifications off. Not total isolation, but enough that the work requires genuine choice to access it. Someone trying to eliminate a habit might add high friction, making it illegal in their home, announcing it publicly with consequences for breaking the commitment, surrounding themselves with people who do not engage in it. Someone trying to build a skill might add low friction, tools easily accessible, time already scheduled, a ritual that makes starting the easiest part of the day. None of these require willpower. None of them are fighting against the system. They are all systems that have been designed to make a specific behavior inevitable. The friction spectrum also reveals something else. Most people do not fail at their goals because they lack willpower. They fail because they have calibrated their friction wrong. They have added high friction to something that needed medium friction. Or they have added no friction to distractions that needed high friction. Or they have built friction that points the wrong direction entirely, toward avoidance instead of toward their goal. The solution is not more motivation. The solution is better calibration. Which brings us to the question that actually matters. How do you know what friction level is right for what you are trying to do? Because that answer, the ability to calibrate friction correctly, is what separates someone who builds systems that work from someone who builds systems that collapse. That is the mechanism we need to explore next. Because once you understand how to calibrate, everything changes about what you can actually build. Now we need to talk about something that will invert everything you just learned. Because here is what separates successful people from everyone else. They do not try to remove friction from their lives. They do exactly the opposite. Everyone else is optimizing for ease, removing barriers, seeking the frictionless path, trying to make everything simpler, faster, more convenient, and in doing so, they are destroying the very thing that would have made them successful. Let me say this clearly. Removing friction is the trap. This is the inversion point. The moment where everything you have been told about optimization reveals itself to be backwards. We are culturally obsessed with frictionless experiences, frictionless apps, one-click purchasing, streaming everything immediately, getting answers instantly, removing all barriers to what you want. And in doing this, we have created a world where nothing matters. Because if everything is frictionless, then nothing is hard to get. And if nothing is hard to get, then nothing feels valuable. Nothing feels like a real choice. Nothing commands your genuine commitment. Everyone is trying to make everything easy, so everything has become trivial. Here is the psychological principle at work. Ease is often a warning signal, not a benefit. Your brain did not evolve in a world of infinite frictionless options. It evolved in a world of scarcity, of limitation, of cost attached to choice. In that environment, difficulty was information. Difficulty meant this matters. Difficulty meant something important is on the other side of this barrier. Your brain learned to pay attention to difficulty, to respect it, to recognize it as a signal that something was worth the effort. But in our frictionless modern world, we have inverted that signal. Now we interpret ease as good, difficulty as bad. We optimize for the removal of friction and call it progress. And in doing so, we have silenced the signal that something matters. Think about what this means practically. When something is extremely easy to access, your brain makes an unconscious calculation. It thinks, this must not be very valuable. Because if it were truly valuable, there would be barriers to it. There would be cost, there would be friction. So you treat it casually, you access it without commitment. You abandon it without loss. You engage with it lightly, because the frictionless availability signals that it is light. This is not a character flaw. This is how human neurology interprets environmental signals. Scarcity signals value. Difficulty signals importance. Friction signals that something deserves your attention. Remove the friction, and you have removed the signal. This is why so many people have unlimited access to exactly what they say they want, and they do not pursue it. They have apps on their phone that promise to teach them everything. They have access to world-class education for a few dollars a month. They have workout equipment gathering dust in their homes. They have written permission from themselves to pursue their dreams. And they do nothing, not because they do not want it, but because they have made it too easy, because there is no friction, because zero barriers surround the path to their goal, and in creating that frictionless access, they have made the goal feel trivial. Trivial things do not command commitment. Trivial things get abandoned. But the person who has made their goal difficult to access, who has created barriers, who has added friction, who has placed requirements in the way, that person has created something that does not feel trivial. That person has made their goal feel like it matters. Here is what most people never realize. Frictionless paths attract low-quality participation. This is the inversion that changes everything about how you build things. If you want something to matter, you do not make it easy to access. You make it difficult enough that only the serious attempt it. You add friction that filters. This is why elite schools have difficult admissions, why professional certifications require years of study, why true communities require investment from members, why the things that matter most are surrounded by barriers, not to be exclusive, not to be cruel, but because difficulty filters for commitment. Easy paths attract casual participation. Hard paths attract genuine commitment, and the quality of what you build depends entirely on the quality of participation. This is why a free online course has 90% attrition, while a paid course with strict requirements has 90% completion. Same material, different friction, different participation quality. This is why a casual running group struggles to build momentum, while a running club that meets at 5 a.m. Rain or shine builds iron-level commitment. Same activity, different friction, different outcomes. Difficulty is not a barrier to what matters. It is the filter that ensures only what truly matters survives. Now we can reveal what was always underneath the principle. When successful people talk about building systems, what they are really talking about is building filters. They are using friction to filter out three things. First, casual participation. They want only the serious, they want only the committed. So they add enough friction that the half-hearted self-select out before beginning. Second, their own inconsistency. They know that future them might not feel the same way as current them. So they add friction that makes it difficult for future them to abandon what they have decided today. Third, low-quality competition. When they make something hard to achieve, they eliminate all the people doing it casually. What remains is only the genuine attempt, only the real pursuit, only the actual commitment. This is why the person with a difficult training regimen attracts different people than the person with an easy fitness goal. Why the artist with a grueling practice schedule produces different work than the hobbyist. Why the entrepreneur who builds barriers around their focus attracts different opportunities than the person chasing every possibility. The friction is a filter, and the filter determines everything. This brings us back to the hidden mechanism that was opened in Section 1. Remember, you wanted to know why successful people deliberately make certain things harder for themselves, and now you can see the answer clearly. They do not make things harder to torture themselves. They make things harder because difficulty is the only force that creates value. Difficulty is the only signal that tells humans, this matters. Difficulty is the filter that separates the trivial from the significant. In a frictionless world, everything is equal. Everything has the same weight. Nothing stands out as worthy of your genuine commitment. But in a world where you have deliberately added friction to what matters and eliminated access to what does not, you have created a hierarchy of value. You have told yourself clearly, this deserves my effort, that does not, and your brain believes you because you have proven it through your actions. But here is what reveals itself now that we understand the mechanism. The real question is not, how do I add friction? The real question is, what do I want my friction to protect? Because friction is a resource. You have limited capacity to create it. You cannot make everything hard. You cannot surround every goal with barriers. So the question becomes strategic. Which parts of your life deserve friction? Which things are worth making hard to access? Which goals justify the deliberate difficulty? The answer to that question determines everything about the person you become. Because the person who builds friction around deep work becomes different from the person who builds friction around entertainment. The person who makes health difficult to access differently lives than the person who makes distraction difficult to access. Your friction architecture reveals your actual values, and building that architecture intentionally is where we go next. Here is something most people do not understand about identity. They think identity is something you discover, something that emerges from who you naturally are, something you uncover through self-reflection and introspection. But successful people know better. Identity is not discovered. Identity is constructed, and it is constructed through friction. Every choice you make under difficulty is a vote for a version of yourself. When you choose the hard path, you are not just achieving a goal in that moment. You are building a narrative about who you are. You are reinforcing an identity. The person who wakes at 5 in the morning to train is not just training. They are voting for the identity of someone who values health. The person who turns down a distraction to do deep work is not just protecting their time. They are voting for the identity of someone who creates. The person who says no to easy money for work that misaligns with their values is not just making a financial decision. They are voting for the identity of someone with integrity. Every difficult choice is a micro-identity decision. And when you repeat these choices under friction, something remarkable happens. The micro-decisions accumulate. The identity begins to feel real. It stops being something you are trying to become and starts being something you actually are. This is the second inversion that changes everything. Most people try to build their identity through internal work, through affirmations, through journaling, through convincing themselves that they are the kind of person who does what matters. But successful people build identity through external action, through friction, through making choices under difficulty that reinforce who they have decided to be. Here is what cognitive science reveals. You do not become someone through belief. You become someone through behavior repeated under constraint. The constraint is the key. When you do something because it is easy, your brain does not update your identity. It just files it away as a one-time action. No big deal. Something anyone would do given the frictionless path. But when you do something because it is difficult, when you have chosen the hard path despite having alternatives, when you have invested effort and attention and time, now your brain updates your identity. It says, this person chose the hard thing. This person is the kind of person who chooses the hard thing. And the next time you face a similar choice, your identity makes the decision easier. Because now you are not deciding whether to do something difficult. You are deciding whether to stay consistent with who you have decided to be. This creates a self-reinforcing loop that most people never access. You add friction to something important. You choose the hard path despite the alternative. This reinforces your identity as someone who pursues what matters. Your reinforced identity makes the next difficult choice easier because it is consistent with who you have become. This further reinforces your identity, and suddenly difficult choices are no longer difficult. They are just what someone like you does. Now, here is where this gets really interesting. Friction does not just build your identity, it also communicates your identity to others. This is the concept of self-selection through difficulty. When someone sees that you have made something hard to access in your life, they make an unconscious calculation. They think, this person must be serious about this. This person has invested real effort. This person has decided this matters. And without any explicit communication, your friction has communicated your identity to them. This is why a person who wakes at 5 in the morning to train attracts different people than a person who plans to work out whenever. The friction is visible. It communicates identity, and it attracts people who respect that identity. This is why a creator who has built a rigorous practice schedule attracts different collaborators than someone whose work is sporadic. The friction shows, it demonstrates commitment, and it attracts other committed people. This is why a business leader who has protected their focus ruthlessly attracts a different quality of team than someone constantly distracted and available. The friction is visible in their decisions. It signals that their time is valuable, and it attracts people who respect that value. This is not about what you do. This is about the kind of person your friction reveals you to be. Friction is a signal, and the signal is powerful. When you have surrounded your deep work with barriers, you are signaling, I am a creator. When you have made health non-negotiable through systems and friction, you are signaling, I am someone who values their body. When you have made your learning public and difficult, you are signaling, I am someone who grows. And people respond to signals. They respond to visible commitment. They respond to friction. The person with friction around their important work attracts collaborators. The person with friction around their health attracts friends who value fitness. The person with friction around their learning attracts mentors who want to teach. Friction is not isolating. It is selective. It filters who enters your circle, and it attracts the right people. Here is the principle that reveals itself. Friction creates identity. Identity creates self-selection. Self-selection creates community. This is why successful people often seem to attract opportunities and people effortlessly. They do not attract them effortlessly. They attract them through friction, through visible commitment, through having made their values clear through the barriers they have built. The friction is doing the filtering work for you. It is telling people who you are without you having to explain it. This is why so many people fail to build the identity they want. They try to tell themselves they are committed. They journal about it, they visualize it, they repeat affirmations, but they have not built friction around it. So there is no external signal, no visible commitment, no barrier that proves to themselves or to others that they actually mean it. Their identity remains internal, remains a nice idea, remains something they think about themselves but have not proved through action. But the person who has built friction around their values, who has made their commitments costly, who has designed their environment so that their stated identity is the only viable path, that person does not have to convince themselves or others. The friction does the work. It proves they are serious. It demonstrates they have decided. It shows who they actually are. This reveals something crucial about why friction matters in the first place. Most people think friction is about the goal, about making the goal harder to achieve so that you appreciate it more or commit to it more deeply. But the real power of friction is not about the goal. It is about the identity that friction builds. Friction is the forge where identity is built. Every difficult choice strengthens the identity. Every barrier you cross reinforces who you have decided to be. Every time you choose the hard path, you are not just getting closer to a goal. You are becoming a different person. A person who makes hard choices, a person who respects their own commitments, a person who builds systems instead of relying on motivation. That person is worth building, and friction is how you build them. But here is what makes this powerful. Once your identity has been built through friction, the friction becomes less necessary. Because you are no longer fighting your own nature, you are aligned with it. The person who has built an identity as a creator through years of rigorous practice does not need friction around their creative work anymore. The identity does the work. The person naturally prioritizes it. They do not have to force themselves to show up. They show up because that is who they are. The friction built the identity, but the identity sustains itself. This is the moment when people often remove the friction, and it still holds, because the identity has become real. So the question shifts now. You understand that friction builds identity. You understand that identity attracts the right people and opportunities. You understand that successful people have used friction to construct themselves deliberately. But what identity are you building through your friction right now? Because every barrier you have placed, every difficult thing you have made yourself do, every inconvenience you have accepted, you are building someone through all of it. The question is, are you building that person deliberately, or are you just letting friction happen to you? That answer determines what comes next. Now we need to talk about the mistake that destroys most people who try to build systems based on friction. They understand the principle. They know that friction filters. They know that difficulty builds identity. They know that constraints clarify priorities, so they try to apply it everywhere. They add friction to every goal. They make everything harder. They surround their entire life with barriers and constraints, and within weeks, it collapses. Why? Because they have confused a principle with a system. A principle is a truth. A system is an application, and the application matters more than the principle. Here is the truth that most people miss. Friction is a resource with limited bandwidth. You cannot make everything difficult. You cannot surround your entire life with barriers. Your psychology does not work that way. Your brain will rebel. Your willpower will deplete. Your system will fail. So the real question is not, how do I add friction? The real question is, where do I add friction? Because that answer determines whether you build something that lasts or something that collapses under its own weight. This brings us to the framework that actually works in practice. It is called the two frictions principle, and it works like this. Friction for important things, friction against distractions. That is it. That is the entire architecture. You do not make everything hard. You make two specific categories hard, and you make everything else irrelevant. Friction for important things means you deliberately add barriers to the goals that matter most. You make the work that creates value harder to access than anything else. You put systems in place that force you to show up. You create friction that requires genuine commitment before you can even begin. But here is what most people get wrong. They stop there. They make their important work difficult, and then they leave all their distractions frictionless. So, they have a hard-to-access goal and an easy-to-access distraction. Guess which one wins? This is where the second friction becomes critical. Friction against distractions means you make the things that steal your attention harder to access than your goals. This is the inversion most people never reach. You do not just make important things difficult. You make unimportant things more difficult. You make social media impossible to access from your primary device. You make entertainment difficult to turn on. You make escape routes require genuine effort to activate. You make distraction costly, and in doing so, you have not just protected your goals, you have made distraction the harder path. Here is the hidden pattern that changes everything. Selective hardship beats universal constraint. When you try to make everything hard, your system becomes brittleness. It breaks easily because it has no flexibility. You rebel against it because there is no relief. You abandon it because the friction is everywhere. But when you are selective, when you add friction only where it matters and remove it everywhere it does not, you have created something sustainable. You have friction around your deep work, but not around the meal you are eating. You have friction around your phone, but not around your family. You have friction around distraction, but not around rest. The selective application is what makes it work. Most people get this backwards. They add friction to things they think they should do, and leave their natural inclinations frictionless. They make exercise hard, but leave snacking easy. They make learning difficult, but leave entertainment accessible. They fight their own nature instead of working with it. But successful people do the opposite. They add friction to distractions and make their important work flow. They make the easy choice align with their goals. They make distraction the hard path and creation the path of least resistance. Psychology drop. Your brain will always follow the path of least resistance. So design your friction so that the path of least resistance leads to what matters. This reveals a principle about how to design your system correctly. You start with a simple question. What do I want to happen more and what do I want to happen less? Then you add friction accordingly. If you want more deep work, you add friction that makes deep work happen. Scheduled time, protected space, eliminated interruptions, friction that forces you to show up. If you want less distraction, you add friction that makes distraction harder. Blocked apps, physical distance, removed temptation, friction that forces you to choose deliberately. And here is the key. These two frictions work together. They are not separate. They are a system. The friction against distraction does not just reduce distraction, it makes your important work more attractive by comparison. The friction for your goals does not just enable them, it makes distraction less tempting by comparison. Now here is where the application gets strategic. You do not apply equal friction to everything. You calibrate based on what actually matters to you, based on what you have decided your priorities are, based on who you have decided you want to become. Someone building a creative practice might add high friction around their creative work. Specific time, specific place, no interruptions, and very high friction around their social media, completely removed. But they might leave zero friction around cooking or exercise, because those serve their energy. Someone building a business might add medium friction around their focus time and high friction around unscheduled meetings, but they might leave zero friction around collaboration with their team, because that serves their business. Someone building their health might add medium friction around their training, scheduled time committed to others, and high friction around processed food, but they might leave zero friction around enjoying their favorite restaurant once a week, because that serves their long-term sustainability. Here is what most people never realize: constraint reveal. What looks like deprivation is actually strategic freedom. When you add friction strategically, you are not depriving yourself. You are protecting yourself. You are protecting your attention, your energy, your capacity to do what matters. By making distraction difficult and your goals accessible, you have not reduced your choices. You have clarified them. You have said, these things matter, those things do not. And in clarifying, you have freed yourself. This creates a second layer that most people miss. When you build two friction systems correctly, you stop needing willpower. Because willpower is what you need when friction is absent. When everything is frictionless, you have to choose through pure discipline, through constant resistance, through willpower. But when friction is built into your system, when distraction is hard and your goals are easy, you do not need willpower. You just follow the system. The system does the work. This is why two friction systems survive, where single friction systems collapse. A single friction system says, I will make this goal hard because I am committed to it. But you have left everything else frictionless. So distraction is still easy. Your willpower runs out. Your system fails. A two-friction system says, I will make this goal accessible through friction, and I will make everything that steals from that goal extremely difficult. Now you do not need willpower. You need acceptance of the system. And that is sustainable. So the real application becomes, build two friction systems, not single friction systems. Make the things that matter easy through strategic barriers. Make the things that steal easy to ignore through strategic barriers. And make everything else irrelevant. That architecture survives. That architecture works. And that architecture is what separates people who maintain their systems from people who watch theirs collapse. But here is what you need to understand before you build yours. Not all friction is equal. Not all strategic placement is obvious, and not all two friction systems are designed for the person you actually are, which means we need to explore how to build the system that works specifically for you. There is a danger that reveals itself once you understand how powerful friction can be. The danger is that you will use it wrong. You will build friction that does not actually work, friction that collapses, friction that becomes punishment instead of protection, friction that you fight against instead of align with, and when that happens, you will abandon the entire principle. So we need to be clear about where friction fails, because understanding the failure points is what separates someone who builds systems that work from someone who builds systems that punish. Here is the first failure point. Artificial friction breaks, authentic friction holds. This is the distinction that most people never learn. Artificial friction is friction you impose on yourself against your actual values. It is constraint for constraint's sake. It is difficulty that does not align with what you actually care about. It looks like this. You decide to wake at 5 a.m. because that is what successful people do. But you actually hate mornings, you hate silence, you hate being alone with your thoughts. You are imposing a 5 a.m. schedule on someone who is not a 5 a.m. person. That friction will break because you are fighting your own nature, because the constraint does not align with your actual identity, because every morning becomes a battle of willpower against yourself. Authentic friction is different. Authentic friction is friction that aligns with what you actually value. It is constraint that feels like protection instead of punishment. It is difficulty that serves something you genuinely care about. It looks like this. You decide to protect your mornings because you value deep thinking. You value solitude. You value that quiet space before the world wakes. You are not protecting mornings because society says you should. You are protecting them because they serve something you actually want. That friction holds. Because you are working with your nature, not against it. Because the constraint aligns with your actual values. Because every morning feels like you are choosing something that matters. This reveals a critical principle. Friction must be custom-built for your actual values, not your aspirational values. Most people fail because they are trying to build the friction architecture of someone else. They are copying the morning routine of someone they admire. They are adopting the constraints of a successful person they read about. They are imposing someone else's system onto themselves, and it does not work. Because the system was built for that person's values, not yours. It aligns with that person's identity, not yours. It protects what matters to that person, but it constrains what matters to you. This is why people can follow someone else's system perfectly for a few weeks and then abandon it entirely. It is not because they lack discipline. It is because the system was not authentic to them. This brings us to the second failure point. Friction becomes punishment when it exceeds your capacity to sustain it. This is subtle. This is where many people build systems that work for a few weeks and then collapse. They understand that friction is powerful, so they add a lot of it. They add high friction to multiple goals simultaneously. They add friction without removing it from anything. They create constraint everywhere. And their system survives for a sprint. But sprints do not last. Humans are not designed for maximum constraint indefinitely. Your psychology requires relief. Your willpower depletes. Your system breaks. Friction that works is friction you can sustain. Friction that exceeds your capacity becomes punishment, and punishment breeds rebellion. Here is what cognitive science reveals. Unsustainable constraint produces the opposite of commitment. It produces resentment. When you build friction that is beyond your capacity to maintain, your brain does not get more dedicated. It gets angry. It starts to resent the constraint. It begins plotting escape. And eventually, you escape. This is why many people who try extreme fitness regimens quit abruptly. Why people who attempt digital detoxes fail within days. Why people who over-engineer their schedules eventually abandon them entirely. The friction exceeded their capacity, so it switched from protection to punishment. And no one sustains punishment voluntarily. This creates a third failure point that most people never see. Pure constraint without flexibility becomes brittle. Brittle systems do not bend, they break. A person who has added so much friction to their schedule that there is zero flexibility looks disciplined for a while, but the moment life changes, an illness, an emergency, an unexpected opportunity, their system breaks. They cannot adapt, they cannot flex, their rigidity becomes their collapse. But a person who has built friction strategically and left room for flexibility can adapt. When life changes, they adjust. They do not lose their values. They just adjust how those values are protected. Sustainable friction is firm but not rigid, protective but not punishing, authentic but not brittle. Now here is the principle that reveals itself. Friction only works when it aligns with your actual values, operates within your capacity, and maintains enough flexibility to adapt. This is why so many people build systems that fail and then assume they lack discipline. They do not lack discipline, they lack alignment. They built friction that does not align with what they actually care about, so their discipline had nothing to push against. The friction felt arbitrary, and arbitrary friction does not hold. This brings us to something crucial. There is a difference between friction you build and friction that is imposed on you. Imposed friction, the kind that comes from circumstances, from other people, from external limits you did not choose. Imposed friction creates resentment. It makes you want to escape. But chosen friction, the kind that aligns with your values, that protects what matters to you, that you have deliberately designed, chosen friction creates clarity. It makes you want to stay committed. The difference is ownership. When you own the friction, it works. When it is imposed on you, it does not. This is why so many people fail when they adopt someone else's system. They are adopting imposed friction instead of building chosen friction. The friction is not theirs. It does not align with their values, so it does not work. But here is what makes this really interesting. Once you understand these failure points, you can design around them. You can ask, does this friction align with what I actually value, or am I imposing someone else's values on myself? You can ask, can I sustain this level of constraint, or have I over-engineered my system? You can ask, have I left room to flex, or have I built something so rigid it will break? These are the questions that separate systems that work from systems that collapse. And asking them before you build is what saves you from wasting weeks or months on a system designed for someone else. So now we know where friction succeeds and where it fails. We know how to build it authentically, how to sustain it, how to keep it from becoming punishment. But there is still one more piece, one more question that needs answering, because knowing how to build friction is different from knowing which friction to build first. And that choice, which friction deserves your attention first, that choice determines everything about what actually changes in your life. Now we arrive at the most important question. You understand friction. You understand how it filters. You understand how it builds identity. You understand where it fails and where it succeeds. You know the principle works. But you do not know where to start. And that matters. Because starting in the wrong place ruins everything. Most people understand this intellectually and then freeze when it comes to application. They think, I should add friction to everything that matters. And they become paralyzed. Because everything feels like it matters. And they cannot add friction to everything, so they add nothing, and nothing changes. Here is the principle that releases you from that paralysis. The friction you build first is the friction that protects your capacity. Not the friction around your biggest goal. Not the friction around your deepest dream. The friction that protects your capacity to pursue any goal at all. Because capacity comes first. Everything else follows. Think about what capacity means. Your capacity is your attention, your energy, your cognitive resources, your ability to think clearly and choose deliberately. Without capacity, every goal is sabotaged. With capacity protected, every goal becomes possible. This is why successful people often sound obsessed with protecting their focus, with guarding their time, with eliminating distraction. They sound obsessed because they understand something fundamental. Capacity is the foundation. Everything builds on it. So the question becomes, what steals your capacity most? Not what distraction is most tempting. Not what goal is most important. What actually consumes your attention in ways that make everything else impossible? For some people, it is social media, the endless scroll that fragments their thinking, the constant notification that interrupts their focus, the algorithmic trap that makes hours disappear. For others, it is open communication, the constant availability, the expectation of immediate response, the culture of urgency that makes deep work impossible. For others, it is the environment, the noise, the interruptions, the constant small demands that add up to complete distraction. Here is what reveals itself. Your biggest capacity steal is usually not your biggest goal. Most people build friction around their most important goal. They add extreme discipline to their career or their creative work or their health. But then they leave the capacity stealers completely frictionless. They protect their work time, but leave their phone infinitely accessible. They guard their creative space but stay constantly available to emails. They schedule their training but leave their media consumption unlimited, and their system fails because the protection is surrounded by theft. The friction protects the goal, but not the capacity to pursue it. This is the inversion that changes the application. You do not start by adding friction to what you want to do. You start by adding friction to what you do not want to do, but what steals from you anyway. You start by protecting your capacity. Only after you have protected your capacity do you build friction around your specific goals. Here is what this looks like in practice. Step 1. Identify your largest capacity steal. What takes your attention without adding value? What fragments your thinking? What interrupts your ability to focus? For most people, it is one of three things: frictionless communication, email, messages, notifications, frictionless entertainment, social media, streaming, internet, or frictionless interruption, open office, accessible phone, unscheduled time. Step 2. Add high friction to that one thing, not medium friction. High friction. Make it genuinely difficult to access. This is not about complete elimination. It is about making the steal require deliberate choice, about making distraction costly enough that your brain stops treating it as your default. Step 3. Notice what happens to your capacity. When you add high friction to your largest capacity steal, something shifts. Your attention stabilizes, your thinking clarifies, your energy extends further. This is not motivation. This is release. You have stopped bleeding capacity. And suddenly you have capacity to work with. Now something remarkable happens. With your capacity protected, your actual goals become easier to pursue, not because you are more disciplined, but because you have the mental resources to pursue them. You have attention, you have clarity, you have energy. The friction you added to protect capacity was not about achieving a goal. It was about creating the foundation for every goal. This is not about what you do. This is about who you decide to be. Once you have protected your capacity through strategic friction, you have made a decision about your identity. You have decided, I am someone who protects their own attention. I am someone who guards my focus. I am someone who chooses deliberately. That decision changes everything downstream. Because now when you add friction to your specific goals, you are adding it as someone who already protects their capacity. You are adding it as someone who has proven they can make hard choices. You are adding it from a foundation of strength, not desperation. This creates what we might call a personal operating system. It is not a set of rules. It is a system where friction has become your default architecture, where you protect capacity automatically, where your important work is defended by design, where distraction requires deliberate effort to access. This operating system does not require constant willpower. It requires acceptance. You accept that this is how you have designed your life, and then the system runs. The power of this approach is that it is sustainable. You are not fighting your nature. You are aligning with it. You are not imposing artificial constraints. You are protecting what you actually value. You are not building brittle rigidity. You are building flexible protection. And because of all that, the system persists. It survives. It evolves as you do. But here is what makes this really important. The friction you build, the system you construct, the capacity you protect, all of this reveals your actual values more clearly than anything you could say about yourself. Your friction architecture is a visible expression of what you have decided matters. It is a map of your priorities. It is a statement about who you have chosen to be. Most people never build that architecture, so they never become clear about their values. They remain in the realm of wish and aspiration. But the person who has thought through their friction, who has asked, what steals my capacity, and what deserves protection, and how do I design a system that works for my actual values, that person has moved from wishing to building. And in building, they have moved from who they hope to be to who they actually are. So the question now is not whether you understand friction. The question is whether you are willing to build it deliberately, whether you are willing to ask yourself the hard questions about what actually matters, whether you are willing to protect that through system, not through motivation. Because everyone understands the principle. Almost no one builds the practice, and the difference between understanding and building is everything. You have now seen the entire pattern. From the moment you asked, why do successful people make certain things harder, to this final moment, every piece has been building toward one realization. Friction is not a tactic. It is not a trick. It is not a hack you use when motivation fails. Friction is a system, and that system is the only sustainable way to build a life that aligns with your actual values. Let me show you how all the pieces work together. We started with a fundamental truth. Friction is a filter. It separates the casual from the committed. It filters out the half-hearted. It ensures that only what truly matters survives. But friction alone does not work. You need to understand why it works. You need to know that decision-making is a finite resource, that your brain is wired for scarcity, not abundance, that frictionless access to everything creates paralysis, not freedom. Once you understand the mechanism, you can see that difficulty has always been trying to tell you something. Difficulty signals value. Difficulty reveals priority. Difficulty builds identity. But here is where most people get stuck. They understand the principle and then they fail in the application. They fail because they do not understand the complete system. The system has 5 parts, and all 5 parts must work together, or the entire structure fails. Part 1. Protect capacity. You start with friction that guards your attention. You identify what steals your focus most. You add high friction to that one thing. This is not about your goal. This is about foundation. Everything else builds on capacity. Part 2. Clarify values. With capacity protected, you can now ask the question clearly. What actually matters to me? Not what should matter. Not what matters to someone else. What do I actually value? Your answer becomes your architecture. Part 3. Build selective friction. You add friction to what matters. You make your core values harder to abandon. You create barriers between yourself and distraction. You design a system where your stated values and your actual behavior finally align. Part 4. Create 2-friction architecture. You do not just add friction for your goals. You add friction against the things that steal from those goals. You make distraction difficult. You make your values the path of least resistance. You create a system where you do not have to choose between what matters and what feels easy. Part 5. Sustain through identity. Every time you choose the difficult path, you reinforce an identity. You are not just pursuing a goal, you are building who you are. And that identity, reinforced through repeated difficult choices, becomes self-sustaining. The friction builds the identity. The identity makes the friction unnecessary. These 5 parts are not sequential, they are simultaneous. They work together as one system. When they work together, something remarkable happens. Your life becomes integrated. Your behavior starts to match your values. You stop performing commitment and start living it. Now here is the framework you can actually use. It is simple, but simplicity is deceptive. Simple frameworks are the most powerful because they are the most sustainable. Step 1. Identify your capacity. Steal. Ask yourself clearly, what takes my attention without adding value? What fragments my thinking most? What is the one thing that, if I eliminated it, would protect my focus more than anything else? For most people, this is obvious. They already know. They just have not been willing to build friction around it. Once you have identified it, add high friction to it. Do not ease into it. Do not add medium friction and see if it works. Add friction that makes the steel genuinely difficult to access. Step 2. Protect capacity for 30 days. Do not try to change everything at once. Do not add friction to multiple things. Do not build your entire system in week 1. Protect capacity for 30 days. Let yourself experience what it feels like to have your attention back. Let yourself notice what becomes possible when you stop bleeding focus. This 30-day window is not a trial, it is a proof. You are proving to yourself that capacity protection works, that it changes things, that it is worth continuing. Step 3. Identify your core values. With capacity returned, ask yourself, what do I actually value? Not aspirationally. Not what I think I should value. What do I actually care about deepest? Your answer might be creating, teaching, building, learning, leading, connecting, healing, growing. Your answer is your architecture. Step 4. Build friction for your values. Once you know what you value, add friction that protects it. Make it harder to abandon your values. Create barriers between yourself and casual compromise. This is not about extreme constraint. This is about protection. Make your values the default. Make drift require deliberate choice. Step 5. Add friction against distractions. For every friction you added, for your values, add friction that blocks the primary competitor. If you value deep work, add friction against meetings. If you value health, add friction against processed food. If you value learning, add friction against entertainment. Make distraction harder than your values. That is all. Step 6. Let identity do the work. Now stop trying, stop pushing, stop willpowering your way through. Follow the system. Make the difficult choices when they come. Watch your identity reinforce itself with each choice. Notice how, over time, the difficult path becomes automatic. The friction has done its work. Your identity takes over. Here is the synthesis that ties everything together. The person you become is the cumulative result of the friction you have built. Not your intentions, not your hopes, not your plans. The friction you have actually constructed, the barriers you have actually created, the difficult choices you have actually made. Your friction is your autobiography. This means something crucial shifts in how you see yourself. You are not a person trying to become something different. You are a person whose environment either supports your values or contradicts them, whose friction either protects what matters or steals from it. And the beautiful part is you can change the environment, you can rebuild the friction, you can create the system that actually works. It does not require motivation. It requires honesty. Honesty about what actually steals your capacity. Honesty about what you actually value. Honesty about the fact that your values only matter if they are protected through system. This is not about perfection. This is about alignment. You will not build a perfect system. Life will change. Your priorities will evolve. The friction that worked last year might need adjustment this year. That is not failure. That is iteration. That is the system working as designed. The person who has built friction architecture does not need everything to be perfect. They need the system to protect what matters most, and they need the flexibility to adapt as their understanding deepens. So here is where you stand now. You understand why successful people deliberately make certain things harder. You understand the mechanism. You understand how to apply it. You understand where it fails and how to avoid those failures. You have a framework you can use immediately. The question is not whether this works. The question is whether you will build it. Because everyone understands this principle. Almost no one acts on it. The difference between understanding and acting is not motivation. It is commitment. And commitment only becomes real when you add friction to protect it. So the next question you face is the only question that matters. What are you willing to make harder? Because your answer to that question, made visible through your actual friction, through your actual system, through your actual choices, that answer is who you are. And who you become next depends entirely on what you decide to protect. You came here with a question. Why do successful people deliberately make certain things harder? And you have found the answer. Not because someone told it to you, but because you have traced the pattern through every layer. You have seen how friction filters, how it builds identity, how it protects capacity, how it creates systems that work. The answer was never about willpower or discipline or some special strength that successful people possess. The answer was about seeing the world differently, seeing friction not as an obstacle but as a tool. Seeing difficulty not as something to overcome, but as something to architect. Seeing your environment not as a backdrop, but as a force that shapes you. That shift in seeing changes everything. Because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. You will walk through your life now noticing the friction, noticing what is hard to access and what is easy, noticing what your actual friction architecture reveals about your actual values. And you will have a choice. You can continue with a friction architecture designed by accident, built through circumstance, shaped by forces you did not choose, or you can design it deliberately. You can ask yourself clearly, what do I actually value? What deserves protection? What steals from me? Where do I need friction? Where do I need freedom? And you can build the system that answers those questions. That system will not be easy. Friction never is, but it will be honest. It will be aligned. It will be sustainable. Because it will be yours. This is what separates those who change from those who do not. Not intelligence, not luck, not circumstances. The willingness to see that friction is not your enemy. The willingness to see that constraints are not limitations. The willingness to design your life around what matters instead of hoping it happens. You now see the pattern. You now have the framework. You now know where to start. The only question remaining is whether you will build it. And that question, answered not in your thoughts, but in your actions, answered not in your intentions, but in your actual friction, that answer is everything.